I never thought a simple property dispute with my neighbor over a 6-foot wooden fence would lead to the most dramatic legal battle of my life. But sometimes, when you're dealing with someone who's determined to make your life miserable, this universe has a way of turning their own weapons against them in ways that nobody could have predicted. What started as harassment over a boundary line that was clearly marked on both of our property surveys became a 2-year nightmare of lawsuits, court hearings, and legal fees that ultimately exposed secrets about my neighbor's property that cost him everything he'd worked for. And honestly, I'm still amazed by how completely the tables turned in my favor. My name is David. I'm 43 years old, and I work as an IT consultant from my home office in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Denver. I bought my house 7 years ago, specifically because I wanted a peaceful place where I could work without distractions and enjoy some privacy and space after years of living in apartments and condos where every noise from neighbors became a constant source of stress. The house came with a large backyard that was perfect for my 2 dogs, and the neighborhood seemed like exactly the kind of place where people minded their own business and maintained their properties without creating drama for everyone else. For the first 5 years I lived there, the neighborhood was everything I'd hoped it would be. I had friendly but not intrusive relationships with most of my neighbors. Everyone kept their properties well maintained, and the biggest conflicts were occasional disagreements about snow removal or where to put trash cans on pickup day. My immediate next door neighbor was an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson who was sweet and quiet, and we'd often chat over the fence about gardening or weather while I was outside with my dogs. It was exactly the kind of peaceful suburban life that I'd been looking for when I decided to buy a house. But everything changed when Mrs. Patterson passed away 2 years ago, and her house was sold to a man named Rick Thornton, who seemed determined to turn our quiet street into his personal battlefield from the moment he moved in. Rick was in his early 50s, recently divorced, and apparently had a lot of anger and frustration that he needed to take out on someone. And unfortunately for me, he decided that I was going to be his primary target for complaints, harassment, and general hostility that made living next door to him a constant source of stress and conflict. The problem started almost immediately after Rick moved in, with complaints about my dog's barking, objections to where I parked my car in my own driveway, and criticisms of how I maintained my yard and garden that were clearly designed to establish some kind of dominance or control over the neighborhood dynamics. Rick seemed to think that moving into the house gave him the right to dictate how everyone else should behave. And he made it clear that he intended to enforce his preferences through complaints, arguments, and whatever legal or administrative pressure he could bring to bear on his neighbors. I tried to be diplomatic and accommodating at first, thinking that maybe Rick was just stressed from his recent divorce and move, and that if I was patient and reasonable, we could work out whatever issues he had and establish a peaceful coexistence. I made sure my dogs weren't outside barking early in the morning or late at night. I moved my car to different spots in my driveway when he complained about blocking his view. And I even adjusted my lawn maintenance schedule to avoid times when he said the noise bothered him. But nothing I did seemed to satisfy Rick, and each accommodation I made only seemed to encourage him to find new things to complain about. The fence dispute that would eventually lead to Rick's downfall started about 6 months after he moved in, when he suddenly decided that the wooden fence separating our properties was encroaching on his land and needed to be moved several feet in my direction. This was completely absurd since the fence had been installed by Mrs. Patterson more than 15 years earlier, and both of our property surveys clearly showed that it was positioned exactly on the boundary line between our lots. But Rick claimed that he'd had his own survey done and that it proved the fence was on his property, though he never showed me this supposed survey or provided any documentation to support his claims. Rick's initial approach was to demand that I pay for moving the fence to what he claimed was the correct position, which would have cost me several $1,000s and reduced the size of my backyard by about 200 square feet of space that legally belonged to me according to every official document related to my property. When I refused to pay for moving a fence that was already in the correct position, Rick became increasingly aggressive and hostile, making threats about legal action and telling me that he was going to make my life miserable until I gave him what he wanted. If you've ever dealt with a neighbor who seems determined to create conflict and drama over trivial issues, you probably understand how exhausting and stressful it can be to have someone constantly looking for reasons to argue and complain, especially when you're just trying to live peacefully in your own home. Over the next few months, Rick escalated his campaign against me in ways that were clearly designed to force me to give in to his demands about the fence. He started calling the city's code enforcement department with frivolous complaints about my property maintenance, filing noise complaints with the police about my dogs, and even contacting my homeowners association with allegations that I was violating neighborhood covenants and restrictions. None of these complaints had any merit, but each one required time and energy to respond to and created additional stress and hassle that Rick hoped would wear me down and convince me to pay for moving the fence just to make the harassment stop. Rick also began a campaign of petty harassment and intimidation that included things like deliberately parking his car in ways that blocked access to my driveway, playing loud music late at night when he knew I had to work early the next day, and even throwing trash and debris over the fence into my yard. He seemed to enjoy finding ways to make my daily life more difficult and unpleasant, and he made it clear that this behavior would continue until I agreed to his demands about the property boundary. The breaking point came when Rick started targeting my dogs with harassment and potentially dangerous behavior that crossed the line from annoying neighbor disputes to genuine threats to the safety and well-being of animals that I considered part of my family. He began throwing objects over the fence when my dogs were in the yard, spraying them with water from his garden hose when they approached the fence line, and making loud noises designed to agitate them and cause them to bark, which he would then use as justification for more noise complaints to the police and city authorities. The most serious incident occurred when I discovered that Rick had apparently thrown something toxic or harmful into my yard that made both of my dogs sick, requiring expensive veterinary treatment and several days of worry about whether they would recover completely from whatever they'd been exposed to. While I couldn't prove that Rick was responsible for poisoning my dogs, the timing and circumstances made it clear that this was likely another escalation in his campaign of harassment, and I realized that the situation had moved beyond simple neighbor disputes into territory that could threaten the safety of my pets and potentially myself. I decided that it was time to take legal action to protect myself and my property from Rick's escalating harassment. And I contacted an attorney who specialized in neighbor disputes and property law to discuss my options for stopping his behavior and establishing clear boundaries about what was and wasn't acceptable conduct between neighbors. My lawyer, Jennifer Walsh, was experienced in dealing with boundary disputes and harassment cases, and she immediately recognized that Rick's behavior was far beyond normal neighbor disagreements and constituted a pattern of harassment that could be addressed through legal action. Jennifer's first step was to send Rick a cease and desist letter documenting his various forms of harassment and making it clear that continued interference with my property and pets would result in legal consequences, including restraining orders and civil lawsuits for damages. The letter also included copies of my property survey and other documentation proving that the fence was positioned correctly on the boundary line, and it demanded that Rick stop making false claims about property boundaries and cease his campaign of harassment and intimidation. Rick's response to the cease and desist letter was exactly what I should have expected from someone who had been escalating conflicts for months rather than trying to resolve them reasonably. Instead of backing down or agreeing to stop his harassment, Rick hired his own attorney and filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that my fence was illegally encroaching on his property and demanding that I pay for moving it plus damages for his supposed loss of land use over the 15 years since the fence had been installed. The lawsuit Rick filed was aggressive and expensive, clearly designed to intimidate me into settling rather than fighting. A lengthy legal battle that would cost both of us substantial amounts of money in attorney fees and court costs. His legal demands included not only moving the fence, but also paying him thousands of dollars in damages for alleged trespass and loss of property value caused by the fence's supposed encroachment on his land. He also demanded that I pay his attorney fees and court costs, essentially asking me to fund his own legal attack against me. Jennifer reviewed Rick's lawsuit and immediately identified several problems with his legal theories and factual claims. That suggested he was either poorly advised by his attorney or deliberately filing frivolous claims designed more for harassment than for legitimate legal resolution. Most importantly, Rick still had not provided any evidence of the survey he claimed proved the fence was on his property, and his lawsuit relied entirely on his own assertions rather than documented proof of boundary violations. We responded to Rick's lawsuit by filing our own counterclaims for harassment, nuisance, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, documenting the months of escalating behavior that had created a hostile living environment and potentially endangered my pets. We also demanded attorney fees and damages for the time, expense, and stress that Rick's frivolous lawsuit and harassment campaign had caused, making it clear that we intended to fight his claims aggressively and hold him accountable for the consequences of his behavior. The legal battle that followed was expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining for everyone involved. But it also provided opportunities to investigate Rick's claims more thoroughly and gather evidence about his behavior and motivations that would ultimately reveal much more serious problems with his legal and financial situation. During the discovery process, where both sides are required to provide evidence and documentation related to the lawsuit, we began to uncover information about Rick's property and personal finances that explained his desperate attempts to extract money from his neighbors and suggested that his legal actions were motivated by financial desperation rather than legitimate property concerns. The first major discovery came when we finally obtained a copy of the survey that Rick claimed proved the fence was on his property. It turned out that this survey had never existed, and when pressed under oath during his deposition, Rick admitted that he had never actually hired a surveyor and had been making claims based on his own amateur measurements and assumptions rather than professional documentation. This admission completely undermined the foundation of his lawsuit and opened him up to potential sanctions for filing claims without proper factual basis. But the more damaging discovery came when we investigated Rick's financial records as part of our counterclaims for damages and attorney fees. What we found was evidence that Rick was in severe financial distress, facing foreclosure on his house and desperately seeking sources of income to avoid losing his property to the bank. His harassment campaign and frivolous lawsuit weren't just the actions of a difficult neighbor. They were the desperate measures of someone who was facing financial ruin and hoping to extract settlement money from neighbors who couldn't afford. Lengthy legal battles. The financial records revealed that Rick had been unemployed for over a year, had fallen months behind on his mortgage payments, and had already received multiple notices of default and foreclosure proceedings from his lender. He had also accumulated substantial credit card debt and personal loans that he was unable to service, and his purchase of Mrs. Patterson's house had apparently been financed through risky loan arrangements that had become unsustainable when he lost his job shortly after moving in. This information explained Rick's increasingly desperate and aggressive behavior toward me and potentially other neighbors, as he was apparently hoping to generate settlement payments or legal awards that would help him avoid losing his house to foreclosure. His claims about the fence and property boundaries were never based on legitimate concerns. They were part of a scheme to extract money from neighbors who might be willing to pay settlement amounts rather than face the expense and uncertainty of defending against his lawsuits. But the most shocking discovery was still to come, and it would ultimately lead to consequences for Rick that went far beyond losing his frivolous lawsuit against me. During our investigation of his financial situation, we uncovered evidence that Rick had been engaging in mortgage fraud and other illegal activities related to his purchase and financing of the house, including falsifying income documentation, misrepresenting his employment status, and potentially using fraudulent documents to obtain loan approvals that he wasn't actually qualified to receive. The mortgage fraud evidence was complex and involved multiple falsified documents, fake employment letters, and altered financial statements that had been used to convince lenders that Rick had the income and assets necessary to qualify for the loans he used to purchase his house. The scheme had apparently been successful initially, allowing Rick to buy a house he couldn't actually afford. But it had eventually collapsed when his real financial situation made it impossible to maintain the mortgage payments and other obligations he'd taken on. Jennifer advised me that this evidence of mortgage fraud was serious enough that it should be reported to law enforcement and regulatory authorities. both because it represented significant criminal activity and because it could provide additional leverage in resolving our own legal dispute with Rick. The mortgage fraud violations carried potential criminal penalties, including substantial fines and prison time, and they also provided grounds for the lender to accelerate foreclosure proceedings and demand immediate repayment of the entire loan balance. We made the decision to report Rick's mortgage fraud to the appropriate authorities, while continuing to pursue our legal claims against him for harassment and frivolous litigation. This dual approach would allow us to protect our own interests while also ensuring that Rick faced appropriate consequences for the criminal activity that had enabled his purchase of the house and his subsequent harassment campaign against neighbors. The response from law enforcement and regulatory agencies was swift and decisive. Within weeks of our report, Rick was under investigation by multiple agencies, including the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, state banking regulators, and local prosecutors, who specialized in mortgage fraud cases. His house was placed under additional scrutiny as potential evidence of criminal activity, and his ability to refinance or modify his existing loans was effectively eliminated due to the ongoing investigations. The criminal investigation also revealed that Rick's mortgage fraud was part of a broader pattern of financial crimes that included tax evasion, identity theft, and fraudulent bankruptcy filings that had been used to avoid debts and obligations from his previous financial troubles. The scope of his criminal activity was far beyond what we'd initially discovered, and it became clear that his desperate behavior toward neighbors was motivated by knowledge that his entire financial and legal situation was built on fraudulent foundations that were beginning to collapse. Meanwhile, our civil lawsuit against Rick was proceeding toward resolution, and the evidence of his mortgage fraud and financial desperation had completely shifted the balance of power in our legal battle. Rick's attorney withdrew from representation when the criminal investigations began, leaving Rick to defend against our counterclaims without legal representation, while also dealing with multiple criminal investigations and accelerated foreclosure proceedings. The combination of civil liability, criminal investigations, and foreclosure proceedings created a perfect storm that made it impossible for Rick to continue his harassment campaign or pursue his frivolous claims about the fence and property boundaries. He was facing potential criminal charges that could result in years in prison, civil damages that could amount to tens of thousands of dollars, and the immediate loss of his house through foreclosure proceedings that had been accelerated due to the mortgage fraud investigations. Rick's last-ditch attempt to resolve the situation involved offering to drop his lawsuit against me in exchange for my agreement not to pursue our counterclaims for damages and attorney fees. But by this point, the situation had evolved far beyond a simple neighbor dispute, and both the civil and criminal consequences of his behavior were largely out of his control. The mortgage fraud investigations were proceeding regardless of our civil lawsuit, and the foreclosure proceedings were being driven by his lender's response to the discovery of fraudulent loan documents rather than our legal actions. The final resolution of our legal battle was both swift and decisive. Rick's claims about defense were dismissed with prejudice after he admitted under oath that he had no evidence to support his allegations about property boundary violations. Our counterclaims for harassment, nuisance, and frivolous litigation were successful, resulting in a judgment against Rick for damages and attorney fees that totaled over $40,000. Rick was also ordered to cease all harassment and contact with me, and violations of this order could result in additional civil penalties and potential criminal charges. But the civil lawsuit was the least of Rick's problems. The criminal investigations resulted in federal charges for mortgage fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy that carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison. Rick ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 years in federal prison, plus restitution to the banks and other victims of his fraudulent schemes that totaled over $300,000. Hard and elderly foreclosure proceedings moved forward rapidly once the mortgage fraud was confirmed, and Rick's house was sold at auction to satisfy the outstanding loan balance and legal fees associated with the fraudulent mortgage arrangements. The sale price was sufficient to cover most of the mortgage debt, but Rick received no proceeds from the sale and lost all equity he had claimed to have in the property. the house that he had fought so desperately to keep and that had motivated. His harassment campaign against me was ultimately lost due to the very criminal activities that had enabled him to purchase it in the first place. The new owners of Rick's former house are a young couple with 2 small children who have been excellent neighbors and have restored the property to the well-maintained condition it had enjoyed when Mrs. Patterson lived there. The contrast between their respectful, friendly approach to neighborhood relationships and Rick's aggressive, combative behavior has been like night and day, and it's been a relief to return to the kind of peaceful living environment that attracted him to the neighborhood in the first place. The legal fees associated with defending against Rick's lawsuit and pursuing our counterclaims were substantial, totaling nearly $25,000 over the 2 years of litigation. But the judgment against Rick covered most of these costs plus additional damages for the harassment and stress his behavior had caused. While collecting money from someone who is in federal prison and has no assets presents obvious challenges, the legal victory was important both financially and symbolically as confirmation that Rick's behavior was unacceptable and that there were real consequences for harassment and frivolous litigation. The experience of being sued over a fence that was legally positioned exactly where it should be, and then discovering that my neighbor's entire life was built on criminal fraud, taught me valuable lessons about property rights, legal documentation, and the importance of standing up to bullies and harassers rather than hoping they'll eventually leave you alone. Rick's escalating behavior was motivated by desperation and criminal activity rather than legitimate property concerns, and giving in to his demands would only have encouraged more harassment and exploitation. The fence that started this entire conflict is still exactly where it was when Mrs. Patterson installed it 15 years ago, precisely on a property boundary line as confirmed by multiple surveys and legal proceedings. Every time I look at it, I'm reminded of how a simple property boundary dispute revealed criminal activity that ultimately cost my neighbor his house, his freedom, and his future, while proving that sometimes standing up for what's right leads to justice in ways you never could have anticipated. The investigation into Rick's mortgage fraud also led to discoveries about similar schemes he had used to exploit other people and institutions, including previous neighbors, employers, and business partners who had been victims of his fraudulent activities over several years. My willingness to fight his harassment and investigate his claims thoroughly helped expose criminal behavior that might otherwise have continued to harm other innocent people who trusted his lies on false representations. The neighborhood has been peaceful and quiet since Rick's arrest and the sale of his house, and the property values in our area have actually increased as word spread that a problematic neighbor had been removed and replaced with a family that maintains their property well and contributes positively to the community atmosphere. The drama and conflict that Rick created during his brief time in the neighborhood has been completely forgotten, replaced by the kind of respectful, friendly relationships between neighbors that make suburban living enjoyable and stress-free. Looking back on the entire experience, I'm amazed by how completely Rick's attempt to harass me into paying for moving a legally positioned fence backfired and ultimately cost him everything he had worked to acquire through fraud and deception. His lawsuit was designed to intimidate me into settling rather than fighting, but the legal process he initiated provided exactly the tools and opportunities needed to expose his criminal activity and hold him accountable for both his harassment and his broader pattern of fraudulent behavior. The 2-year legal battle was expensive, stressful, and time-consuming, but it also demonstrated the importance of having good legal representation, thorough documentation of property boundaries and neighbor interactions, and the willingness to stand up to people who use legal threats and harassment to try to get their way. Rick's assumption that I would be intimidated by his lawsuit and willing to pay money to avoid conflict proved to be a serious miscalculation that ultimately led to his downfall. The IT consulting work I do from my home office has been much more productive and enjoyable since the neighborhood returned to its normal peaceful atmosphere, and my dogs can once again enjoy playing in the backyard without fear of harassment or dangerous objects being thrown at them. The stress and anxiety that Rick's behavior created for nearly 2 years has been completely replaced by the kind of calm, secure living environment that I originally sought when I bought the house. The relationship I now have with Rick's replacement, Neighbors, has been everything that neighbor relationships should be. Friendly but not intrusive, helpful when needed, and respectful of property boundaries and privacy. They've never questioned the position of our shared fence. They keep their property well maintained, and they contribute to the kind of positive community atmosphere that makes living in a suburban neighborhood pleasant and rewarding. The legal precedent established by our successful defense against Rick's frivolous lawsuit and our victory on counterclaims for harassment has also provided protection against future neighbor disputes, since any potential troublemakers now understand that harassing behavior will be met with serious legal consequences rather than accommodation or settlement payments. The $40,000 judgment against Rick serves as a strong deterrent to anyone else who might consider using legal threats and harassment to try to extract money or concessions from neighbors. The criminal convictions for mortgage fraud and related financial crimes have ensured that Rick will be unable to purchase property or engage in similar schemes for many years to come, protecting future neighbors and communities from the kind of harassment and criminal activity that made his brief residence in our neighborhood so disruptive and stressful. His 5-year federal prison sentence, plus the substantial restitution requirements, have provided meaningful consequences for behavior that harmed multiple victims and violated the trust that communities depend on for stable, peaceful living. Environments. The professional relationships I developed with Jennifer Walsh and other legal professionals during the lawsuit have also been valuable for ongoing property and business matters. And I now have a better understanding of property, rights, boundary laws, and legal remedies for neighbor disputes that will serve me well if any future issues arise. The experience of successfully defending against frivolous litigation has also increased my confidence in standing up for my rights, rather than being intimidated by legal threats from people who are trying to take advantage of others' desire. To avoid conflict, the documentation and evidence-gathering skills I developed during the investigation of Rick's harassment and fraud have been useful in other aspects of my IT consulting business, where thorough research and careful documentation are essential for resolving technical problems and protecting client interests. The experience of working with attorneys, investigators, and law enforcement agencies has expanded my professional network and increased my understanding of how different types of expertise can be combined to solve complex problems. Most importantly, the experience taught me that people who seem determined to create conflict and extract money through harassment and legal threats often have hidden vulnerabilities and secrets that make their aggressive behavior a desperate attempt to cover up more serious problems rather than a position of strength. Rick's constant escalation of conflicts and threats was actually evidence of his desperation and criminal activity rather than confidence in his legal position, and his willingness to file frivolous lawsuits was motivated by financial necessity rather than legitimate property concerns. The contrast between Rick's approach to neighbor relationships and the approach taken by the family who bought his house after foreclosure illustrates the difference between people who contribute positively to community life and those who see neighbors as potential sources of conflict and financial exploitation. Good neighbors understand that property boundaries are clearly defined by legal surveys and documents, and they focus on maintaining their own property and building positive relationships rather than looking for ways to create disputes and extract concessions from others. The fence that Rick claimed was encroaching on his property has become a symbol of the importance of standing up for what's right even when faced with aggressive legal threats and harassment. The boundary line that the fence marks was established by professional surveyors and confirmed by legal documents, and no amount of false claims or intimidation could change the actual location of property boundaries that were properly established and documented years before Rick ever moved into the neighborhood. The peaceful resolution of the fence dispute, combined with the removal of a neighbor who had been engaging in criminal fraud and harassment, has restored the kind of community atmosphere that makes suburban living enjoyable and secure. The property values in our neighborhood have benefited from the elimination of a source of conflict and criminal activity, and the families who live here can focus on maintaining their homes and building positive relationships rather than dealing With constant disputes and legal threats, the experience of being sued over a fence and discovering that my neighbor was a criminal who ultimately lost his house instead has become a favorite story among friends and colleagues who appreciate both. The irony of the situation and the satisfaction of seeing justice served in such a complete and unexpected way. The fact that Rick's attempt to steal property from me ultimately cost him his own property provides a perfect example of how karma and legal consequences can combine to ensure that fraudulent and harassing behavior eventually backfires on the people who engage in it. If you've made it through this long story, I hope it provides useful insights for anyone dealing with difficult neighbors or property disputes and demonstrates the importance of standing up for your rights rather than being intimidated by legal threats and harassment. Sometimes the neighbor who seems most aggressive and confident about their legal position is actually the one with the most to hide. And thorough investigation of their claims and background can reveal vulnerabilities and criminal activity that completely change the balance of power in any dispute. The fence is still exactly where it should be. Rick is still in federal prison, and my neighborhood is once again the peaceful place I originally chose as my home. The 2 years of conflict and legal battles were stressful and expensive, but they ultimately led to a resolution that protected my property rights, eliminated a source of harassment and criminal activity, and provided a strong deterrent against future frivolous lawsuits and neighbor disputes. Sometimes standing up to bullies leads to discoveries and consequences that go far beyond the original conflict, and justice is served in ways that exceed anything you could have hoped for when the dispute first began. The neighbor who sued me over a fence that was legally positioned exactly where it belonged ultimately lost his house, his freedom, and his future due to the criminal fraud that had enabled him to buy the property in the first place. His harassment and legal threats were motivated by desperation rather than legitimate property concerns, and his attempt to extract money from neighbors through intimidation and frivolous litigation ultimately exposed the very criminal activities that led to his downfall. The fence remains where Mrs. Patterson installed it 15 years ago, precisely on the legal property boundary, while Rick serves his federal prison sentence and contemplates the consequences of building a life on fraud and harassment rather than honest work and respectful relationships with his community.